If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. I have had the opportunity this season to present to you love stories. And I have an epic love story to tell you today. It is a love story that lasted 28 years. It is the kind of love that's made for movie screens, and the kind of love that romance writers wish they could write. And I dare say that if this is not my favorite love story that I tell this season, it will easily be at least in the top 3. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 16th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserved to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time, there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Rose Cleveland. Rose Elizabeth Cleveland was born on June 13, 1846 in Fayetteville, New York, United States. Her mother was Anne Neal, and her father was Reverend Richard Foley Cleveland. Rose was the youngest of 9 children. Anne and Richard's children were Anna Neal, William Neal, Mary Allen, Richard Cecil, Stephen Grover, Margaret Louise Foley, Louis Frederick, Susan Sophia, and then Rose. To her family, Rose was known as Libby, but that was just within her family, so I'm going to call her Rose for this episode. She grew up with a father that was a Presbyterian minister. Richard was strict. He made his children devote their entire Sundays to worship and prayer. Richard did not make a lot of money as a minister, so Rose did not grow up rich. Rose was not a quote-unquote typical girl. Rose did not follow the gender norms of her time. Rose preferred spending her time outside instead of doing things that were deemed women's activities during her time. The Cleveland family moved to Holland Patton, New York in 1853. It wasn't long after the move that Rose's father died. Richard died on October 1st, 1853. Rose was 7 years old. When Richard died, there were still 7 of his 9 children that were living at home, including Rose. The Holland Patton congregation came together and they bought Rose's home, and they let Rose and her family stay in the home for free. So it was a similar situation that happened to Eliza Hamilton after Alexander Hamilton died. Rose's brother Stephen, that went by his middle name Grover, paid for Rose to be well educated. Rose went to Houghton Academy in Buffalo, New York. She went there from 1864 to 1866. When she graduated, she began teaching history and literature at Houghton Academy. In 1867, she moved to Lafayette, Indiana. There, she taught literature, math, and Latin at the Collegiate Institute. She then taught at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, which that college is named after Alexander Hamilton, someone that I already did 3 episodes on this season. Then she made the move to Muncie, Pennsylvania to teach at an all-girls school. Rose then returned home to Holland Patton. She returned home to her homestead that they called the Weeds because she was ill. After she got better, she returned to teaching at Houghton Academy. She also taught Sunday school. In the 1880s, Rose's mother became sick, and Rose cared for her. So she had that in common with the subject of last week's episode, Emily Dickinson. Rose's mother died on July 13, 1882. Also, in 1882, Rose's brother Grover was elected the governor of New York. Rose was offered a teaching position in New York City, but she turned it down so she could help out Grover in the New York State Executive Mansion. That is where the governor of New York lives. Something else that she had in common with Emily Dickinson was Rose was also a poet. She published 2 of her poems in The Independent when Grover was the governor of New York. Grover became the 22nd President of the United States on March 4, 1885. When Grover became the president, he was not married. There was once a rule that required a female relative to serve as the First Lady if the president was unmarried or widowed, which that was bullshit, because what would have happened if someone was elected president and they didn't have a wife, but no one in their family wanted to be the First Lady? I don't have the answer for that because Rose became the First Lady, but she hated it. The First Lady had to entertain the wives of cabinet members and foreign guests, something that Rose had no interest in. She was a blue stocking, which meant that she was more interested in educational pursuits. When she would host receptions that she thought were boring, she would conjugate Greek verbs in her head. Other reasons why that she hated being the First Lady was she couldn't go to private dinner parties or go to public markets, and the public scrutinized her for her necklines. Even though Rose hated hosting receptions and dinners, she was good at it. Rose was well liked, though many thought that her firm demeanor was intimidating. She had progressive views. She was a public supporter of women's suffrage. She was also a supporter of the temperance movement. She actually banned wine at the White House. She was sympathetic to the Victorian dress reform. That movement was about making clothing more practical and comfortable. Though she was sympathetic to the cause, she wasn't fully on board with it for herself. Though she did wear low-cut dresses that showed her shoulders, and like I said earlier, that was controversial. She supported women in science. She promoted the Women's Anthropological Society. Though she was a supporter of women, she was not a supporter of Catholics. She actually told Grover not to appoint Catholics to government positions. So she was the opposite of Queen Christina of Sweden, because if you remember back to her episodes, she wasn't really a fan of women, but she didn't care what religion you were. The writer, Eugene Field, wrote a ballad that Rose was the subject of, and that ballad was about whether or not Grover was going to get married. In between her hosting duties, she managed to write. She wrote George Eliot's poetry and other sketches in 1855. She also wrote a collection of lectures entitled Sketches of History. She wrote You and I, Moral, Intellectual, and Social Culture in 1866. She also published a novel entitled In the Long Run. She wrote a satirical poem about women's rights titled The Dilemma of the 19th Century, and she also wrote an essay about women's rights titled Women in the Home. Rose wished that her brother would marry someone so she would no longer have to be the First Lady, and on June 2nd, 1886, Rose got her wish. Grover married Frances Folsom in the Blue Room of the White House. Grover was 49 years old and Frances was 21 years old, and they had known each other since Frances was an infant. And Grover had been Frances's unofficial guardian since she was 11 years old and Grover was 39 years old. And if that gives you the ick, then you are not alone. Grover actually did some other shitty things than just marry his ward, but I'm not going to get into those things because that is a whole other episode entirely in itself. I don't know if I will ever do a Grover Cleveland episode, but I know that this is not a Grover Cleveland episode. This is a Rose Cleveland episode. So I'm not going to go down any further into the Grover Cleveland rabbit hole. A month after Rose left the White House, she moved to Chicago to become the editor of the magazine Literary Life. Grover asked Rose not to take the position. He said that he thought that they were taking advantage of her because she was a sister of the president. He offered her $6,000 a year for her not to take the job. That is $203,467 in 2023's money. Rose turned down her brother's money because she wanted to make her own. Being an editor of a magazine was a rare job for a woman during this time. She only stayed at the magazine for a few months though because she became ill and the magazine was having some money problems. During this time, her family home caught fire. And in 1887, Rose moved to New York City to teach history at Sylvanus Reed's School for Girls. Rose wasn't one for the social scene. Instead, she liked to stay home and write. She published a short story that women's fashion was detrimental to their health. It was called Robin Adair, and it was published in Godey's Ladies book in 1887. In 1888, she left Sylvanus Reed's School for Girls because there was a dispute over her salary. She co-authored a book with suffragette Frances Willard titled How to Win, a Book for Girls. After that, she traveled around Europe. Before Grover left office, Frances Folsom held a lunch in Rose's honor. In the winter of 1889, Rose took a vacation to Florida. There in Florida, Rose met the love of her life. Her name was Evangeline Simpson. Simpson was her married name. She was born Evangeline Elizabeth Thurston Mars. She had married Michael Hodge Simpson in 1882. Michael was wealthy and 48 years her senior. When he died, he left Evangeline an estate of anywhere from $10 to $12 million. Rose met Evangeline when she was 43 years old, and Evangeline was probably 33. We don't know for sure if Evangeline was born on January 15th, 1855 or 1857. Rose and Evangeline spent their time in Florida falling in love. And then, when warmer weather arrived, they went back to their homes. Evangeline lived in Massachusetts. When Rose arrived home, she wrote an essay called My Florida, and it encouraged people to visit Florida. When the women returned home, they sent love letters back and forth to each other, beginning in April of 1890. Rose writes, quote, "My Eve, ah, how I love you! It paralyzes me. Oh, Eve, Eve, surely you cannot realize what you are to me, what you must be. Yes, I dare it. Now I will no longer fear to claim you. You are mine by every sign in earth and heaven, by every sign in soul and spirit and body, and you cannot escape me. You must bear me all the way, Eve." End quote. The next month, Rose sent her another letter, quote, "You are mine and I am yours, and we are one, and our lives are one henceforth. Please, God, who can alone separate us, I am bold to say this, to pray, and to live it. Am I too bold, Eve? Tell me. I shall go to bed, Eve, with your letters under my pillow." End quote. Rose's letters to Evangeline are unfortunately the only one of their letters that survive to this day. But lucky for us, Rose did quote Evangeline a few times in her letters, so we know at least bits of Evangeline's letters to Rose. This is Rose quoting Evangeline, quote, "Oh, darling, come to me this night, my Clevie, my Viking, my everything. Come. God bless thee." End quote. Rose responds back to her, quote, "Your Viking kisses you." End quote. Now, during this time, there still wasn't a word for a woman that was in love with a woman. No gay woman was calling herself a lesbian. The word lesbian existed, but only in the reference to the Greek poet Sappho. She was from the island Lesbos. So, like I say in the intro to all the episodes this season, some of these modern day terms that I'm using to describe these people this season were not terms that they used to describe themselves. And Rose had a hard time figuring out the wording. She writes, quote, "I cannot find the words to talk about it. The right word will not be spoken." End quote. So, because sexual orientation wasn't really a concept yet, though this was during the time when the conversation about sexual orientation did start, but because the conversation was just getting started, Rose would not have called herself a lesbian. But I think it is accurate to say that she was one. Never in Rose's life was it documented that she was interested in anyone other than Evangeline, and she was never married to anyone. Everyone that I have researched this season before Rose, from King Edward II to Emily Dickinson, there have been some scholars that have been uncertain and cautious to call them members of the LGBTQIA community. Even though, in my opinion, I think there is enough evidence to say that they were. Even in the less clearer cases, like Queen Christina of Sweden or Florence Nightingale, I feel like there is at least enough evidence to say that they were not straight, or at the very least, they were not allosexual. There has been so many relationships that I have talked about this season that some just describe them as being really good friends. But with Rose and Evangeline, I didn't come across anyone that argued that they were just good friends. Rose and Evangeline were pretty open about their relationship. Well, as open as you could be about your relationship with another woman in the 19th century. They vacationed together in Europe and the Middle East. They bought property in Florida together. They didn't hide their relationship from their families. Rose even wrote to Evangeline's mother about her love for Evangeline, and it appears that both of their families were cool with their relationship. which is just awesome. That's not something that I thought that I was going to encounter this season. Rose and Evangeline would stay at each other's estates for extended visits. Evangeline gave Rose the pet name Clevie, and Rose gave Evangeline the pet name Wingy. They also had an inside joke going where Rose called herself Grandchilly and Evangeline Granny. That was because Rose was 10 years older than Evangeline, which is giving me a little bit of a King James VI and First and George Villiers vibe, but I think James calling himself George's father was probably because James had some daddy issues that he needed to address. But with Rose and Evangeline, this literally just seems like a joke. We can also gather from Rose's letters that it appears that not only was Rose and Evangeline's relationship romantic, but it was also sexual. Rose writes, quote, my Cleopatra is a very dangerous queen, but I will crush those Anthony-seeking lips because I am her captain. How much kissing can Cleopatra stand? End quote. In another letter, Rose talks about, quote, long, rapturous embraces that carry us both in one to the summit of joy, the end of search, the goal of love, end quote. Now, like with pretty much all of the love stories that I have told this season, there was a bump in the road for Rose and Evangeline. Relationships are hard. They are even harder to a certain degree when you have to have them in private. In 1896, Evangeline made a decision that left Rose heartbroken. Evangeline announced in 1896 that she was engaged to Bishop Henry Whipple. He was a popular Episcopal preacher from Minnesota. Henry was 34 years older than Evangeline. Evangeline's family and friends were shocked. They knew about her relationship with Rose. Evangeline didn't need Henry's money. She still had millions from when her first husband died, so that was not the reason why that she was marrying him. Evangeline was 40 years old at this time, and at 40 years old in the 19th century, she was probably past her childbearing age. So it appears that the reason why that Evangeline got engaged to Henry was because she had feelings for him. Evangeline wrote in her diary that she had affection for him. Now, she clearly also had affection for Rose. So, did she get engaged to Henry because out of the two, it was the more easier relationship? Was it because it was the relationship that society would accept? Or were her feelings just that deep for Henry? I don't know. What I do know is that it was devastating news for Rose. Rose begged Evangeline not to marry him. Rose writes to Evangeline, quote, I do not think you need me now, but I plead that you will consider what I said this morning. I will give up all to you if you will try once more to be satisfied with me. Could you not take 6 months for that experiment? We would go away from everyone. End quote. Evangeline married Henry on October 22nd, 1896. Rose took off to Europe with a female friend 3 weeks later. She did not return for 3 years. Rose continued to write to Evangeline, but the tone in her letters were different. She didn't talk about her love for Evangeline. The pet names were gone, and she ended all of her letters formally with her initials REC. Then Henry died on September 16, 1901. Shortly after his death, the pet names in Rose's letters returned. She started to call Evangeline Granny again. Over the next 9 years, their letters turned from the wild and passionate love to a steady tenderness. Evangeline continued to live in Minnesota, but Rose and Evangeline resumed their extended stays at each other's homes. In 1909, Rose was tired of the back and forth. She writes to Evangeline, quote, I need you, and life is not long enough to always wait, end quote. In 1910, Evangeline's brother, Kingsmill Mars, became seriously ill while he was living in Italy. Evangeline and Rose rushed to be by his side. The two women shared a cabin on their ship as they made their way across the Atlantic. Before Evangeline left, she told her housekeeper not to move anything while she was away. She told them that she would be back. Evangeline never returned. Kingsmill died, but Rose and Evangeline stayed in the Tuscan village of Bondi di Lucca. World War I started in 1914. Rose and Evangeline organized and funded relief efforts, and they helped out refugees. Then the Spanish flu pandemic happened. A friend of Rose's got the Spanish flu, and she cared for them. While caring for them, Rose got the Spanish flu herself. Rose died on November 22nd, 1918. She was 72 years old. She was buried in Bondiluca, Italy. Her funeral was attended by many of the refugees that she helped out during World War I. The mayor of Bondiluca and the American consul also attended. The mayor ordered for all businesses to be closed for the day. Her coffin was draped with the 13-star flag of the United States. Evangeline was devastated. She wrote to her stepdaughter, quote, "The light has gone out for me. The loss of this noble and great soul is a blow that I shall not recover from." End quote. Evangeline lived for another 12 years. She wrote a book about Tuscany and she dedicated it to Rose. Evangeline died on September 1st, 1930 in London, England. She died of pneumonia and kidney failure. She was buried next to Rose. In 1969, a descendant of Henry Whipple donated a collection of family papers to the Minnesota Historical Society. The descendant probably didn't know that Rose's love letters to Evangeline were in the box that they were donating. When the staff discovered the love letters, a memo warned that some of the letters, quote, "strongly suggest that a lesbian relationship existed between the two women," end quote, and should be hidden from the public. And they were hidden away from the public for a while. Then, in 1978, the Gay Task Force of the American Library Association requested that they be cataloged. The full collection of letters were not published until 2019. And now you can read them for yourself in Lizzie Aaron Holt and Tilly Lasky's book, Precious and Adored, The Love Letters of Rose Cleveland and Evangeline Simpson Whipple, 1890 to 1918. And that was the life of Rose Cleveland. Thank you so much for listening to the 16th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I'm going to cover 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Virginia Woolf. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover. That is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the Zippa Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. I also have some affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those affiliated links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast as well. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.